All right, so chapter 2. Chapter 2, what are we talking about? Global connections, right? This chapter is focusing on globalization and a lot of thoughts and theories about globalization. It starts out with this image, talking about how space is more relative than it is often conceived. Like they had this quote from Waldo Tobler: "Everything is related to everything else. The near things are more related than our distant things," which sounds very illogical. But in reality, this example in India, you could see a little bit of what may be called a shanty town. You see things like this around the Twin Cities sometimes, right? Along the highways and whatnot. So the example in the book is they talk about, for example, a person on a motorbike headed to work, working in maybe the high-tech sector in India. They're relatively near these other populations, right? But probably don't have any actual networks to these other populations, right? Completely different friend group, different, maybe possibly in this context, language and cultural norms, all kinds of things. So people who are relatively close to each other could be relatively very far away when it comes to their actual lived experiences. Globalization, like I said, the main topic of this chapter, but of course, this term and concept, I know maybe as you're reading chapter 2, you might have felt a little overwhelmed because there's just a ton of concepts, right? Tons of different words and technical jargon even here and there. Well, all these things will actually come back to in every chapter. And so you don't have to know the ins and outs of every term backward and forward immediately, because we're going to come back to it. Chapter 3, Chapter 4, Chapter 5, Chapter 6. So as I was saying, globalization processes heightening interactions, increasing interdependence, and deepening relations across country borders. Pretty general definition. One of the first examples of globalization used in the text is globalization and glocalization, which is how local cultures kind of change things. So you could have something that has a global reach, like any one of a number of different religions, right? Often have global reaches. Often this is a product of earlier colonial periods, right? But examples of how local places kind of take these and wall paint them with their own colors, as you could say. An example of a church in India, right, using more of normal local color patterns, designs, right? You could see that they're connected, right? You can see that these things are part of a global network, but at the same time, they're very unique and different on their own. So when it comes to globalization, in geography, there's basically two main ways of looking at globalization. There are the theorists of weak globalization and strong globalization. What these mean, the main differences are weak globalization theorists see globalization as something that has just kind of been going on just for, ever since humans have been around. Some aspect of this has been happening, right? And there was a big increase in the 1500s with Spanish and Portuguese empires, right, that had global spread. These were some of the first empires that had what you could call truly global reach. These systems, well, the Spanish and the Portuguese, they're large colonial empires in their day. Now they have, relative less influence, less importance. I was just in Portugal this summer, and it was interesting actually because, well, anyone ever been to Spain? If you go to Spain and you visit like the Royal Palace, you'll see just everything covered in gold, right? And this huge wealth and opulence. that still exists in parts of Spain for certain people and certain families. Portugal doesn't really have that vast wealth anymore. Past different governments spent it on different things. So their relative importance, Portugal being a country of only say 10 million people, but in one of their main colonies, former colonies, Brazil, you have like 200 million people, right? In the Portuguese economy today, a big part of it is tourism, and a big part of it is tourists coming from Brazil, because very often if you want to be a tourist somewhere, it's handy to go someplace that you use the same language, right? So it's kind of one of those ironies of what happens through time. All right, strong globalization, right? Weak globalization ties it to colonialism and looks at the repercussions that still happen today. Those who believe in what's called strong globalization, they feel that those earlier modes of globalization really do not have as much consequence as basically what's happened after the 70s. What's happened after the 70s? For a number of reasons. Well, during the colonial period, nation states had a lot of power and control, right? And you had a number of different countries that were vying to dominate the globe if they could. Well, strong globalization argument looking at more recent history, well, as soon as we had satellites going up and we had instantaneous communication, strong globalization, they feel that that is really when globalization really took off. And whereas previous phases of globalization involved states that were strong actors, today it's more global corporations, right? Big, large companies that really can often decide what happens in different countries. Countries increasingly kind of have less control over their own policies. We'll talk about those in some specific details. So weak globalization versus strong globalization. So colonialism, colonization, taking over a territory and physically controlling its government and economy for its own benefit, right? Now the roots of the colonial empire that a number of different European countries specifically had, well, their roots were in, previous phases of colonization. So for example, the ancient Roman Empire had colonies in Spain, right? What would happen is you would have the empire have big wars, and to reward the vets of those wars, they would give them some estate out in sometimes recently conquered areas. So for example, well, Spain, it's somewhat ironic that Spain was a colony of Rome, and then Spain went on to attempt to colonize elsewhere. Greece had the same kind of thing. Most ancient empires did this kind of thing. This is one of the reasons why, in modern day Iran, you still have populations whose ancestry is from Mongolia, because Mongolia was a large empire that spread out in lots of places. When they did, they sent their people to live in those places. And very often they just did not go back when that empire fell, right? People stayed in place. Triangular trade system. I know you look at this and you don't really see a triangle, but in a nutshell, the economy during the first big wave of globalization, the colonial empires, their economies were based on agriculture, right? And for agriculture, well, they used enslaved peoples, right, to work on those farms, and enslaving people, those colonial powers found to be incredibly financially successful, made them a ton of money, right? Now, how is it triangular? Well, these same ships, they wouldn't want to have them go empty, and you actually have ocean currents that kind of pick certain routes that you need to take, and so you would have, when the enslaved people would be dropped off, well, they would have all these agricultural products that you would then load up into the ships. And those products you would send off to places where they would be processed and or sold. right? So I know this doesn't look like a triangle, but it's called triangular trade system. So a number of the big players during the first wave, Spain, Portugal, Great Britain, France, well, they colonized lots of areas besides South and North America, but those were the main areas during this first time period. Again, agriculture, the main thing driving the economy. Let's see. So yes, if you have agriculture, what do you need? Well, you're gonna have labor, large areas of land, right? And so you had the conquistadors coming on in to most of the Americas, taking over large areas of land, mostly for agriculture, because that's how they're getting their money. Another big purpose during colonization, one of the things that they used to kind of motivate their people was the belief that their specific religion was superior and the correct religion, and that is what they would bring around to the different areas that they took over. That and other cultural norms. The two waves of colonization. You can see here a bit of a dip, right? You see it increasing through time, and then it dips and kind of crashes. Does anyone know why it dipped in that period of time? What slowed down the colonial process? Yeah?
Industrial Revolution?
That is an excellent guess, but not quite yet. Not quite yet, yeah.
So like wars?
Nah, there are wars all the time. They're all at wars all the time. Yeah.
Was it a plague?
A plague? That's a fair guess, but no. No. Countries started outlawing slavery, right? The main part of that trading system was forced labor that makes a ton of money. Great Britain, I think it was 1807. Of course, in the United States, it wasn't until many years later, right? The time frame is uneven, but a number of countries, one by one, through time, you have what happens historically, which is you have new generations of people who are born, and they decide on different norms, and very often they see what previous generations have left them with, and sometimes they keep things, and sometimes they discard things, right? So you got a new generation who came about who decided that, they started outlawing slavery. But you can see it picked up again right here in the guess about the Industrial Revolution and industrialization. That is what powered the second wave. Indeed. No longer agricultural so much. So second wave colonization, you can see countries like Portugal and Spain have dropped out of this, although they kept their colonies because they still were sticking to an agricultural basis of their economy. When the other countries were switching to industry, they just fell by the wayside, right? The second wave, well, the Americas had been kind of divided up, and so a number of other countries started aiming for other areas of the world, right? Primarily Africa and Asia. Again, industry this time. So if you have industry, if you have industrial production, what are your needs compared to agriculture for making your money? Well, for industry, if you're gonna make something, you just need the stuff that makes that stuff, right? What makes the stuff? Well, people, so you got labor, switch to waged labor, and then just raw resources, stuff, the raw material that you need to make your more complex things, right? In economics, I believe it's called value added. When you take some raw materials, I don't know, some wood, some other materials, and you make a thing out of it, and then you sell that thing, you sell it for more than the parts that it took to put into it, right? Because you're going to make a profit. Still, these colonization efforts still had the cultural aspects of trying to spread their various religions, but also lots of other cultural norms. Each of these countries, the colonial powers, they basically all thought that the way they did everything was a superior way of doing things for everybody, whether it's their religion or even how you dress, right? And so they would try to spread those norms, very much often telling themselves that they're making places better because every place should be like their place, right? This is a map from the book looking at dominant colonial influences. It's not, it's one of those maps in the books that you have to really like kind of zoom your eyes in on to take in. Included in this was later phases. So you have things like, what was called the scramble for Africa, because Africa was a place that was seen as being huge and having lots of resources. So the European countries wanted to divide it up amongst themselves. And you had all kinds of different wars that were happening. This colonialism, colonization, keep in mind that this was, of course, a forced thing, right? They would go in with gunboats and just go into places and literally just take whatever they wanted and then bring it back to their host country, right? And they would write adventure books about it, give you all the details. So we know very explicitly what was happened, what everyone did. So an example of one of the wars that came about, the Opium War. Has anyone ever read about the Opium War? It's kind of well known. So, if you're going to give a summary of the Opium War, would anyone give it a go? All right, now I have two people raising their hand, and I know if I point to one of you, you both will think I picked both of you.
I'm not going to go because I haven't read it in a while.
All right.
Vaguely, China was pretty closed off and wouldn't trade with the UK. So the UK sent a bunch of opium and kind of forced China to open trade. That's pretty much all I know.
Yeah, so if Britain wants to make money on trade, right? Trade, well, what that means is you get some stuff for a low price. If you steal it, that's a very low price. But if you get some stuff for a low price, you bring it back to your country, you sell it, you make money, right? Now, when we talk about industrialization, China actually industrialized before most of Europe. China was pretty ahead of the game in lots of ways. We'll, of course, talk about that a lot when we get to that chapter. So China had lots of great industrial goods. So, all kinds of things. I know people think of silks, but like plates, dishes, like there's a reason we call it China in this country. Lots of manufactured goods. Now, in order to trade, you got to have something that country wants, right? Now, because China was kind of in the lead technologically compared to a lot of the European countries, the stuff that those countries brought over to trade, China was kind of like, well, we could already make that, and we make it for cheaper. So why would we trade, right? Well, that wasn't a good enough answer for Britain. So Britain, they were like, well, opium is really addictive. People pay money for it. We're having a little bit of a trade deficit. So what if we just ship a bunch of drugs over to China? That'll make us money. Now, as you can imagine, China's, when this is brought in and you had whole areas of people that became addicted, not great for your economy, as you can imagine. Especially when this was introduced to places where this was a completely new thing. People didn't know what this was. Sometimes people thought this is maybe a medicine, maybe this is something useful. Through time, China eventually just outlawed it, right? And they're like, okay, we got to stop having this stuff brought in here. During colonialism, of course, the colonial powers don't really recognize the authority of any other country besides themselves. Sometimes they recognize the authority of other countries that they align with. So they just decided that, you know what, we'll just come on in with a bunch of cannons and we'll just blow a bunch of stuff up and take over an area, and then we'll be able to just bring in opium. And the British did that, and it was very successful. They took over large areas. They increased their trade at the barrel of a gun. Crazy things that happen in history. There's a section in this chapter about decolonization or post-colonial relations. It talks about, when a number of countries became independent, right? And countries have been fighting for a long time for independence. There was a huge number that became independent in the late 1940s, 1950s. What was the timing 1947 for this example of Pakistan? Why didn't a lot of countries get their freedom from their colonial powers during that period of time? Yeah.
World War II.
Yeah. A few different things happened. I don't know if people study World War II very much, but Europe a bit self-destructed, right? Massive damage. Countries had to rebuild, and they actually just didn't have the power to keep those colonies anymore, right? And the different colonies had been fighting for the independence for years and years and years and years. There was also something else that happened. I was mentioning how like new generations will do things differently, right? Like you're a new generation of people, and you're gonna go out and do things in the world, and things from previous generations, like you'll do some things like maybe your parents would do it, but you'll probably do lots of things not like your parents would do it, right? So you had a new generation in Europe, who looked at the Second World War, which was literally Germany practicing colonization within Europe. The same thing, an empire taking over land, taking their stuff, enslaving people for work, all the same stuff. There's a lot of people where they don't kind of understand something until it happens to them, That's kind of like a human mindset maybe. It's like, oh, if something happens, that's other people that happens to. I don't have to worry about it. Well, when this happened within Europe and people realized, that sucked, and so there was a big anti-colonial wave that happened. That and also, like I said, they couldn't actually just have the resources to keep control of these different areas anymore. So an example of globalization from the text, United Nations increasing in membership through time, right? And this is as each of these countries started declaring independence, very often they would decide to join the United Nations. The United Nations, conceptually, part of the reason it exists is to help countries basically keep their own integrity, right? Define if you join the United Nations, then you're recognized as a country with these borders, and if anyone tries to invade those borders, the UN technically would do something about it, right? So you can see membership rose by quite a bit through time. During these colonial periods of time, this Columbian Exchange, as it's called, it helped the economy of lots of places that were involved in it, not just because of trade, but because, these new things were useful in the new places that they'd be brought to, including things like, agricultural methods. An example they use in the textbook, West Africans who brought rice farming methods to the American South, right? So not only were these crops brought elsewhere, but also the people who actually knew how to farm them, right? They'd bring their knowledge of different things with them. All right. I'm gonna throw a lot of terms at you. Again, remember, these terms will come back in future chapters, so you don't have to know all the ins and outs of all these, but I'm going to give you some broad overviews. Also, after the Second World War, there was a belief that if countries had a lot of open trade, and if they were financially interdependent, maybe they would be less likely to go to war with each other, right? Because you're cutting off your own economy. So right now, for example, during our pandemic times, you might be shopping and you'll find out that they have supply chain problems, right? It's like, since places are getting cut off and whatnot, and they're goods that we're used to getting, like inputs for different products and things. So if that slows down, it's in your economy's interest to keep that trade going. So some organizations that came about, actually I think we'll take these all one at a time here. The World Bank, you might have heard of the World Bank in other classes. Created to help rebuild Europe after World War II. So reconstruction loans, right? Europe was blown up. The philosophy was, well, at the end of the First World War, the countries that lost, not only did they not get help rebuilding, but they actually had to pay financial penalties to the winners, right? So you had a country like Germany that was badly defeated in World War I, and then the economy had even less money and resources to help people out because they were paying for this retribution money to other countries. And well, leaving Germany in that kind of vulnerable state, they felt was part of what facilitated the rise of fascism there and elsewhere in Europe. And so the thought was, well, what if instead we help them rebuild and they have good economies, the people will be less likely to feel like they need revenge or to take over their places for their own economic means. Now, of course, through time, these places rebuild. And so the World Bank still exists. And so now it's switched from, rebuilding places that were war-torn to just places that want different development strategies, right? And the whole next chapter after this, chapter 3, you talk about development and how it's defined and all that. What this meant in this example, a lot of development projects that countries wanted were dams, so you would have hydroelectric power, you would have a reservoir of water for drinking and whatever else you need. Development projects like roads, railways, things like this that the countries would help them kind of economically develop. Headquartered in Washington, D.C., president is by tradition an American. So the World Bank only has Americans in charge of it, right? International Monetary Fund. This is more about the World Bank was loans for development projects. International Monetary Fund is, let's say, you've probably heard about the U.S. being in debt, right? We have the national debt. Well, this is something, if you have a country that's quite a bit smaller, they may not have the ability to pay off those debts the way the U.S. does, or other countries do. And so International Monetary Fund will help if there's something that has happened and maybe a country is going to be in debt, right? This is for short-term things. President is by tradition a European. You get another organization, World Trade Organization. The organization that it started off through GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, that was a post-World War II organization that, again, wanted to facilitate trade between countries because it felt that would kind of bind countries, right? Get countries to be on friendly terms. Switched to the World Trade Organization when it switched from just being kind of like within Europe or within the United States to being worldwide. But this is an organization that has a specific political bent, which is that completely free and open trade benefits everybody, right? So that is what it pushes to do. So these organizations, IFIs is what we term them, international financial institutions. International financial institutions. Let me describe structural adjustment policies. So, countries sometimes have problems happen. You could have a natural disaster. In this example, in the 70s and 80s, the price of oil went up a lot, right? Might have read about it in history books. When that happened, a lot of countries suddenly found normal things and their prices go up because oil has inputs in a lot of things that you do other than just obviously driving, right? Fill up your gas tank. If oil price goes up, you have less money in your pockets because you still got to drive where you got to drive, right? But also all the things that oil goes into manufacturing, so like plastics and all kinds of stuff. So the price of everything went up. A lot of countries, when that happened, they went into debt. And international financial institutions, there's a general view that countries' governments were too big, and that's why they were spending too much money. And the feeling was that governments are not as efficient as they should be. Which, you know, sure, plenty of governments are not as efficient as they would otherwise be. And so structural adjustment policies was basically these financial organizations saying, well, we're not going to help you with your debts unless you cut your government budgets. And in theory, the thought was that those governments would say, oh, well, okay, we have some wasteful spending, we have this, and we'll get rid of these things that are wasteful spending, cut costs, and be able to pay back our loans. But what those governments around the world did with structural adjustment policies, well, the things that they cut their spending on were social services like education, right, and basic health, sanitation, things that, well, if you're talking about a place wanting to develop, if you cut that stuff out from under them, that's like the basis of them being able to develop, right? And so these countries did far worse under these policies that were supposed to make them better and bigger than ever before. But that's because it came from a theoretical basis. So countries did this, and it did not help them in their development prospects. It wasn't until actually relatively recently, the past like 10-ish years, that there was a mindset, a realization that, you know, these things didn't actually help these countries, they didn't work, so let's switch to different strategies. And again, we'll talk about more recent stuff in the next chapter, but a lot of that stuff, of course, in our COVID times, is like, well, who knows what's going to be going on now. This mind frame that I was talking about, became known as the Washington Consensus. Washington Consensus. Let's see. A little bit more history about financial flows and things. I mentioned that the price of oil went up in the 70s and the 80s. It's interesting because, well, what happened was a number of countries that produce oil got their independence. And when they were looking at the main resource that they had, oil, they realized that during the colonial period of time, the profits for oil were all going to the colonial powers, not the local countries, right? And so they said, well, the price for oil is so low, we're not really making that much money, and we really want to develop. And it seems to me like a higher price could be established, and so they just put up the prices of oil, and this happened a number of times. So if you can imagine economically, the price for oil right now, let's say it doubled this year. That's a big increase, right? It's like everyone would have to reevaluate how much oil they're using, and then let's say next year it doubled again, right? That's the kind of thing that happened in the 70s and 80s. The price of oil really went up. And so this did a number of things. The United States, having a lot of international clout, talked countries that were oil producers into, when they sell that oil, that they would sell it in dollars, right? So what this meant was there's all of a sudden a big demand for US dollars. Before that, we had a floating currency at that juncture. We had a gold standard before that, which was like for each dollar you have, it's worth a set amount of gold. And then when countries had the gold standard, you would have big amounts of gold that you would have as your backup, that you would have in your bank. So if you ever heard of Fort Knox being full of gold, that's part of the reason why gold was it's still valuable today, but it was really valuable at the time, because it was kind of like, the guarantee of your paper money. But we switched to a floating currency because we realized that the United States had such international financial clout, the value of our dollar would actually go up because countries would want to use it because it's relatively stable, right? Actually, trying to remember. Sorry, I'm just going to preview myself a little ahead and see. All right, what we got left to cover. Another international organization, United Nations, talked about it a little bit previously, but let's talk about it as far as power, right? Each country is a member, so if there's a General Assembly vote, all countries vote on things. But there is a Security Council, right, of the main 5 kind of power brokers worldwide. These are basically the people who were, at the end of the World War II, the winners, right? They're the ones who had all the power to make this organization. So United States, Russia, China, France, and the UK, right? Now the UN itself doesn't have a giant amount of power, has some amount of peacekeeping operations, especially if, like I said, if there's international borders that have been, had military incursion from one country into the other. Sometimes the United Nations will be sent to intervene, sometimes not though, because if any of these countries decides to say no, then it's no, whatever the thing is. Peacekeeping mission. So who else are the international players on our global stage today? Non-governmental organizations, NGOs. And these are a lot of different things, The primary examples from the book are charities, and that is a big thing of NGOs and what they do, but all kinds of things. Again, we'll do more examples in each chapter as we go. The other big international power players are multinational corporations, right? As I was saying, the strong globalization mindset is that these actually have far more power than actual countries anymore, right? Especially if you have completely open trade, well then it's the companies that they're doing the trade that make a bunch of the decisions. Main elements of our current technology, especially multinational corporations, agricultural, extractive industries, infrastructure, basically everything that goes on in your economy. Another concept from this chapter, hegemons, or hegemon. Has anyone ever heard of this term or word before this class? Maybe? So,
Not a lot.
a lot?
No, not a lot. I mean, I've heard it talked about a little bit, but no one talks about it a lot previously.
Well, we'll talk about it some. Basically, well, as it says, the state that is the world power and shapes the tone and rules of politics and trade in a particular era, right? And there are a number of eras where, like, you had one country, even though there were other countries that had relative amounts of power and they would go to war sometimes, according to this theory, you have one power that is kind of setting the rules in a time frame, right? Different pastimes, Spain, Netherlands, Great Britain for a large period of time, United States, right? Kind of more recent. There's lots of arguments about, well, who will be the next hegemon and who won't, you know? I would say most people were kind of figuring China would be the next big hegemon, the big power player. And when COVID came about, there were a lot of back and forth about, well, what is going to happen to that thought that China was going to be this big global power? Some people felt that there would be kind of vaccine diplomacy, right? Where China was making a bunch of vaccines ahead of time. It's like, well, maybe China would make connections with countries, be in their goodwill due to access from vaccines. But actually, other countries have produced a lot more vaccines. And also some interesting things have happened. So for example, after COVID hit, India actually limited how much China could invest in their economy. A number of countries actually felt that they were vulnerable in trade to China, and so they actually started cutting off some connections from China. And so then the new theory, people are wondering, well, maybe China will be the next big global power, right? Because they're actually the center of some of the most major vaccine manufacturing. But then, well, India was hit with the Delta variant, and then they stopped selling vaccines to other countries because they want to vaccinate their own country. Makes sense, but when you're talking about international power plays, it's like, well, who's going to be the power of the future? It's like, well, we won't know until the future happens. The theory of looking at hegemons also looks strongly at not just one dominant power and what that means, but also the other side of that coin. What do local people do? What agency do they have, right? When we talk about agency, the ability of local actors and individuals to voice an opinion or affect change, right? So there's a lot of different ways people, of course, have power over their own lives, even if we have global powers that surround us and decide a lot of our policies. Individuals have individual power to do lots of things. You could do selective adaptation, negotiating globalization by choosing to adopt some policies and changes that work for your country, but not others, right? Example from the book, it was looking at large grocery chains, and it was looking at the fact that, well, a lot of countries, although there will be large grocery chains, international chains that will come in, very often people want to buy fresh stuff from local farmers, right? That's some of that happens here in the US. People go to farmers markets. You also go to the big grocery store too for other things, but you're deciding, you're making local decisions. Also, globalization. Globalization, well, adapting a global phenomenon to suit a local need or context. So there are a couple different examples. One being, if you ever travel and you go to a McDonald's, for example, it's not just a carbon copy of what we have here. Like, they will take local tastes and preferences into context. And like, to me, it's one of the more interesting things when I travel. I always kind of duck my head into a McDonald's and see what kind of weird things they have, because they'll have different McDonald's versions of local things. Another example of globalization was during the Arab Spring. For a little while, some people were referring to it as the Facebook revolution because, well, Facebook being an international thing, right? Not from the area that had the Arab Spring, but people were using it to communicate and to coordinate various revolutions through Facebook, right? They're using something else, something from a worldwide global corporation, and using it for their own purposes, right? All right, I think that's all I'm going to cover for today, because as always, I do want you all to work on some questions. This time what I'm going to do, sorry, I got to get it to the actual, where the questions are. Preview of stuff we'll be looking at. All right, 4 questions for you to work on. Groups, smaller groups, 3 to 4 per group. I'll let you self-select, but feel free to move around and like meet new people, do a reintroduction. But same thing as always, 1 piece of paper, answer these 4 questions. If you got a question about the questions, come on up and ask me, and I'll tell you what you need to know. But start off with this. Make these circles overlapping weak and strong globalization. Just write at least one thing in each area, right? What's area that they overlap? What's the thing that's just with strong? What's the thing that's just with weak? And then you do these 1 through 4. All right. Success to you. Traffic jam in the corner. Are you guys a group? All right.
We're all.
No, it has to be 3 to 4 per group. So it's 2 groups. What groups do you want to be?
I'm just join the class, so.
All right. how about, if I may, the 4 of you be a group, because he's new, so he'll need a little help, and the 3 of you, you're old timers, so you'll be able to just get through it, all right?